want to thank the Cats caterers, who also didn't have an easy task to put this together this evening. When you came this evening, booklet, which is a zikaron of some of the writings of Rav Breuer to commemorate this evening. This was published by the Joseph Breuer Foundation, thanks to the munificence of the Schwalbe family, and I'm about to get in a lot of trouble with my good friend Dr. Bondi, who served as the editor of this very worthy publication, and we thank you. Our next speaker is the grandson of Rav Breuer Zatzal, Rabbi Dr. David Beckhoff. I have a little problem with David. He doesn't want me to call him doctor, he doesn't want me to call him rabbi. I feel embarrassed in such a wonderful audience to call him David, but I think he'll be more for me if we'll just address him as David. That's what he wants, so fine. But we know the true story behind Dr. David Beckhoff. David had the great zchus to grow up in the home of Rav Breuer and was offered to learn almost daily with the Rav until his Petira. After attending Ner Yisrael for 2 years, he returned to our Beis HaMedrash and received smicha from Rav Schwab Zecher Tzadik Livrocha and Lahavdi Ben Chaim L'Chaim Rav Breuer Shlita. He graduated from City College in 1978 and received a doctorate in microbiology from Columbia School of Medicine in 1984. He is currently an associate professor of biochemistry and molecular biology at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Since the end of the Shloshim of Rav Breuer, David continues the twice-weekly Gemara Shir of Rav Breuer. This continuing Shir was established by Rav Breuer in 1940. It's an honor for me to present to you Rabbi Dr. David Beckhoff.
Thank you, Rabbi Katzenstein. Or should I say Edwin? And thank all the board members, especially my brother, for forcing me to speak tonight. Public speaking is not exactly my favorite thing to do, but I'm glad that I have the opportunity to express some thoughts from the family side. B'shus Mordaz Rav Geli, B'shus Rabbanim, B'shus my parents, who for 27 years were the host and bore the major responsibility for my grandfather. B'shus all my uncles and aunts, and especially B'shus my cousins who are here tonight, whom I suppose I'm supposed to represent. The first issue that came to mind when I was preparing for this speech was, what should I call the object of tonight's gathering? Should I say Opa? Or should I say Rav Breuer? Or should I say the Rebbe, as some of us only half-jokingly still refer to him? And really, for us in the family, Upa and Rav Breuer were the same thing. He was our Upa, but he was our Rav. He was the one who we went to for Hadracha, for Psak. And I would think that the members of the Kehillah, to whom he was Rav Breuer and who was respected, and in fact were in awe of him at times, but he was also their Upa, in a way that he gave them his kind, sage advice throughout his life. So allow me to reminisce for a few moments about the last years that I was fortunate enough to have a close relationship with him. And I'd like to make 3 points in the course of these remembrances. Now, a number of my older cousins, especially Elliot Bondi, Ralph Silverman, Paul Breuer, had learning Siddurim with my grandfather on a weekly basis. And it was really in Tannersville that us younger cousins, we were always and are still considered the younger part of the family. Us younger cousins were introduced to Upa's Derech HaLimud. He gave a daily shiur in Tannersville around the dining room table, which was attended by grandchildren and also non-family members who were in Tannersville during the summer. And this is when we were first exposed to something which wasn't exactly what we had in our yeshiva experience, but it was his Derech HaLimud, which was a clear-minded approach to Pshat. Pshat, which represented his years of toil in understanding and being able to clearly explain what was going on in the Gemara. When there was a klomar in Rashi, we remember this was cause for great excitement. What would one have thought was the Pshat? What is the Pshat? When Tosfos says V'im Tomar, V'kosher, Tema with a Hey, Tema with an Aleph, what is all clear, to get absolute clarity, what the Marsha says in Tosfos, and then his forays into the Rishonim, into the Rosh, into the Ran, which he, in Yoni Halacha, which he loved so much. That was our exposure on a daily basis in the summer. And it was only years later that I really was able to appreciate that when you would learn with him and he would learn a Mishnah and learn a Rashi on a Mishnah, and you would sort of wonder a bit, why is he saying that's Pshat from Rashi? And then you'd realize, maybe days or weeks later, that a Gemara, 2 blocks later, the way he understood, the way he learned it, that's what Rashi meant in the Mishnah. Absolute clarity. That was the daily shiur. That was the concept. And then there were the occasions, the spontaneous speeches almost to the grandchildren in his study there in Tannersville. And these occurred very often, for example, on a Tisha B'Av afternoon or on a Shivat B'Tammuz in the afternoon, where his breadth and scope of Tanakh and Medrashay Chazal and Agoda and his view of Jewish history and his view of the future Klal Yisrael and the coming of the Geula was presented to us in a way that we saw his vision, but in a language, the classic German, which I don't know if we all completely understood, but we got the message. That was all until the summer of 1974. At that time, Upa was 92 years old. He was still the rock of our family. And at that time, his lifelong hasmada, which depended on his sight, now depended on his hearing. This is for someone who had been learning for over 80 years, and one can imagine the shock that he must have had to know that from now on he was no longer able to read anything. And this might have devastated any other person, a regular person, but not him. So that summer I came back from Ner Yisrael, I was in yeshiva, and since I was living at home with my parents, so I was the natural choice to become a chavrusah, to have a seder kavua with him almost daily. Now, his major chavrusah actually at that time was Rabbi Jacob Weinberg, who some of you may remember. He was attended Upa's shiur, the Monday, Wednesday night shiur, and he was able to spend the time every morning to learn with my grandfather to prepare for the shiur. Rabbi Weinberg was a Gerer Chassid, and he was a Talmud Chacham also, and there established a relationship between my grandfather and Rabbi Weinberg, which was a beauty to behold. And I want to tell you the following story to illustrate the strength of Rav Breuer. A couple of years after this happy relationship of daily learning with Rabbi Weinberg, Rabbi Weinberg all of a sudden became ill and was nifter. And I got a call from my Uncle Yaakov in the Beis Medrash one morning. I was learning there under Rav Breuer, and he told me to come home right away. And the plan was that he would go into Upa, tell him about Rabbi Weinberg, that he was nifter, give him a couple of minutes, and then I was supposed to go in to take his mind off it, so to speak. So I rushed home. Uncle Yaakov went in to the study, and in his soft, kind way, broke the news to Upa de Rabbi Weinberg, who was his joy in life, had been nifter. Uncle Yaakov went out, closed the door, and a couple of minutes later he told me to go in. And I was, of course, petrified. But I walked in and sat down, and you could just see him physically using his strength that he had to overcome his emotion. Because life goes on. And we opened the Gemara, we were learning Sanhedrin at the time, and we went on as if nothing had happened. That was, to me, that crystallized to me the strength of his will. And then the summer of 1978, where I had finished undergraduate school and not yet started graduate school. So I was in Tannersville the whole summer. I had lots of time. And we must remember that in 1978 he was 96 years old. Not only that, but he had had a heart attack, a major heart attack in 1947, years and years earlier. He was certainly not a well man. But there he was, and it was established that I should learn with him twice a day, from 11 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon, and from 5 in the afternoon till 7 in the evening. Wonderful, two hours during the day. And the hasmada, at that age, and you couldn't see, he had to listen. You always had to listen. But we would be learning for 2 hours. Comes 1 o'clock, my mother comes into the room and knocks on the table, sight, 1 o'clock, time for lunch. And Upa would say, gleich, you know. And he went on learning. Afternoon, 7 o'clock, dinner time, my mother would come in, knock on the table, sight. He would say, come gleich. He just kept on learning. That was his hasmada. We went through together, Mesechus Avodah Zarah, Gemara Tosfos, Mesechus Siyum, Mesechus Rosh Hashanah. That's what he was at that age, at that stage of his life. But as astounding as that is, one can think, well, okay, you know, he was retired from public life. He had stopped speaking. Actually, my bar mitzvah was the last Shabbos that he spoke in shul in 1967, so that was a long time before. And he was retired, so he has a lot of time, so he'll sit and learn. But we have to think back to the earlier years. And I have here a copy of what's called the Winter Program. This is a pamphlet that was put out by the Kehillah for the Winter Program for 1945-1946. Now, some of you still remember those days. 1945, the war had just ended. There were sons and husbands who were at war, who one didn't know whether they were coming back. There were people who had mishpacha still in Europe. Did they survive the Holocaust? Did they not survive? And in the Rav's own family, he hadn't seen my Uncle Mark since 1938, I believe. His own children were getting married. In that year, 1945, 1946, Tante Rosie, Uncle Samson, and Yuval L'Chaim, Tante Edith all got married in those 2 years. And the economic situation in the Kehillah at large and in his family was certainly not rosy. And 1945 actually was when, 1944 was when the yeshiva was founded. The mikveh was built in 1945. And in those days of the infancy of all these institutions, obviously, the Rav had to be a very hands-on person. Everything was being established at the time. And with Dr. Muller, who was president almost alongside the years that Upa was the Rav, they were involved in things that now run on their own. And just to get a glimpse of what was going on in those times, I took a little sneak view into the desk that is still, Upan's desk is still in more or less the same condition as it was 20 years ago. And there are stacks of letters, copies of letters that he sent. I don't know why he saved some and not others. And of course, these are not for publication. But just let me read you some of the items that were on the agenda in those days. So there's a letter about supervision of a bakery, establishing supervision of a bakery here. There were at least 6 butcher shops, maybe 7, under hashgacha in the neighborhood at the time. So there were weekly meetings with the shaftim, with the mashgichim. There's a letter about establishing kashrus at Bronx Lebanon Hospital. There are several letters about Pesach products. He was very concerned that the Kehillah members should have what to eat on Pesach. There's a letter about trying to convince the membership about the importance of keeping Chalav Yisrael, which was not so pashut in those days. And there's an interesting letter in terms of kashrus to a particular store where he writes the following. I thought this was interesting. Among the regulations signed to by you is one that your wife is expected to keep her hair covered while working in your store, which gives you an idea of what he was contending with in those days. And finally, there's another letter here about, in the Synagogen Committee, about an incident where there was a bar mitzvah in shul, and relatives, non-observant relatives of the family came to shul with their pocketbooks and umbrellas, it's raining, and what can be done about that in the future. So that's the background. So, in that background, what were the shiurim that Rav Breuer gave in 1945, 1946? So there's a list here, if you'll allow me to read from here. First of all, dinim, daily after Shabbos. This is a few moments after Shabbos that the Rav still gives today. Mishnayos, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday after Mincha. Again, that's a shiur that's continued to this day. Then there was a Seder in Menorah HaMa'or, a Musar Sefer twice a week, including Sunday after Mincha. And then the Gemara shiur. So, Mesechus Pesachim, Sunday and Wednesday after Shabbos. One has to remember that in those days there was only one Shabbos at 6 o'clock, and twice a week, Balabatim learned Mesechus Pesachim. Mesechus Beitzer, Shabbos 1 hour before Mincha. That is a shiur that still is given by the Rav today. Then Mesechus Beitzer again for beginners, it says, on Sunday at his house at 10 o'clock in the morning. Then Mesechus Baba Basra, Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 7:45 p.m. in his home. And, if that's not enough, Mesechus Chulin, Monday and Wednesday at 9:15 in his house. So, for example, on a Monday and a Wednesday night, he was giving a shiur in his house from 7:45 till probably 10:15, and holding two Mesechus at the same time. And I must say here, and you'll pardon me, Rav Breuer was not a big fan of Daf Yomi. He didn't care for the superficial nature of that kind of learning, and so that wasn't, certainly not his style. And it was in those times, 1945, 1946, that these shiur were going on, and that's what he expected of his Balabatim. So that's point number one. Point number one is the hasmada in the world of Shas and Poskim, not to mention the Divrei Agoda. There are stacks and stacks in his desk of pieces of paper which were the notes for his speeches that demonstrate his incredible sweep of Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, Medrashe Chazal, Agoda, that was in his speeches, but that the writings, the notes really reveal his breadth. So that's point number one. Point number two is the respect that he had for all of the grandchildren. No matter what their relationship to him was, and no matter how often they got to meet him, but despite his living in that world of Chazal, that world of Shas and Poskim, he was able to demonstrate his respect for each individual. And I'm thinking here of the Sunday evenings. Occasionally, my parents were out of the house on Sunday evening, and so some of us grandchildren were pressed into service to serve dinner. And my cousin, Ricky Jacoby and Diane Landstrom were often there. And he would sit at the table and talk for an hour. He would tell us his stories, we would tell him our stories. And I must say that actually he was a terrible storyteller. He always, when he was telling something funny, he always laughed before he got to the punchline. But he was able to relate to all of us in his special way. Now that's not to say that there weren't some expectations. I mean, heaven forbid, if you came to visit him before the Yom Noroim and didn't know precisely all the drushes and the Shabbos and Takanas Hachamim while we blow 100 kolos on Rosh Hashanah. He expected you to know certain things. And we all in the family knew that he was very upset if we didn't know where a certain pasuk in Chumash was, which parsha it came from. And you can ask my cousin Avram Gutman, who was his special assistant for years in shul and had a regular kfiyus with him, that we had a little trick that if you didn't know where something was, you guessed Kiseitze. Because there are lots of things in Kiseitze. And of course, if you didn't guess Kiseitze, and it wasn't Kiseitze, he would pound on the desk and say, Kando in Kiseitze Shin. So, he had respect for all his grandchildren, and this translated, or in a general way, he had respect for anybody in all walks of life. And so whether you were cut out for learning, and you were sitting in Kollel, he respected you for that. And if you were a professional, he respected you for that. And he was a great believer in Rabbi Hirsch's approach. There are 12 shvatim, and they each have their own purpose in Klal Yisrael. So, no matter what you were, if you were a bookkeeper, he respected you for that. If you were a mother, children who had a question about something educational, he respected you for that. If you were a housewife and had a shaila, he respected you for that. And I heard recently from a student of his, a student in Frankfurt am Main, who said the following word: Rav Breuer had the respect of his students because he respected them. That's point number 2. And finally, point number 3 is that Opa was the embodiment of Rav Hirsch in our times. What I mean to say that not the replanting of the Kehillah on these shores, or the Auschwitz Shita, or Torah Derech Eretz, which are also beautifully described in the narrative in the biography, and we give credit to Uncle Mark for persevering and seeing that project through. But I'm talking about the writings of Rabbi Hirsch. He knew every single word of that by heart. And when he spoke in shul at affairs, he was really the verbal representation of what Rav Hirsch was in writing. 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago, he was in Beis Israel Hospital in the CCU, and I was asked to go down and be there for Shabbos, and I joined my cousins, Ralph Silverman and Ali Bondi, who were the doctors. I was there that day. There are a lot of stories that were passed around what happened in the last 24 hours, and they all have a grain of truth, and many of them are not 100% true. But I have a written account of what happened in those wondrous 24 hours. And around 7 o'clock, Friday afternoon, I went in and davened Kabbalah Shabbos with him. I remember that I was singing the Luchadodi to this, the Omer Nigun, and he told me to be quiet because I thought I was disturbing people around. And so I finished davening with him, and then I went out, and my cousin Elliot went in. And in what was probably one of the last conscious things he said. Well, Elliot told me afterwards that he told them how important it was to disseminate the works of Rabbeinu Hirsch, and he praised Uncle Jacques Schwalbe, his uncle, and the family for the efforts that they made in publicizing these works. So that was basically the last conscious thing that he said. Now imagine, this is one moment, the last moment, in the life of the tzaddik. And he says one thing. And of course, he said it to the right person. And because of Dr. Bondi's perseverance, we now have the collected writings, volume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and now the new Vayikra Chumash, which has just been published. And so, the one sentence in the life of a tzaddik generates a lasting gift for all of us. And so, I think that we who reap the benefits of his blessed life, the spiritual, also the physical benefits of the Kehillah, have a responsibility to use what was left behind, his legacy, which is in the writings of Rabbeinu Hirsch, and to study them, to study the Chumash, to know Rabbeinu Hirsch's shittas in Kachim, in Mitzvahs, in Sefer Vayikra, and hopefully, Yez Hashem, the other Chumashim will be coming in the following years. And so in this spirit of Rabbeinu Hirsch's writings, I just want to conclude with a quote from his Perush on Tehillim. The pasuk says, Ki mevorachav yirshu aretz. Those who are blessed by him shall inherit the earth. And Rabbeinu Hirsch writes that the tzaddik devotes all of his life to making God's kingdom a reality in this world. Indeed, he brings about the early beginnings of this glorious era by stamping the impress of God's service not only upon himself, but also upon his children, his relatives, and upon all those who come within the scope of his influence. Every tzaddik who has lived his life in a constant endeavor to do his duty shall live on in the ever purer conduct and ever more fruitful life of his physical and spiritual posterity. In this manner, the tzaddik attains immortality even on earth below, and he will live on even in the lives of the generations of the remotest future. Amen. Ken Yiratzah.